PlayStation has a live service problem. We've seen a number of games from the last few years become cancelled as of late and have teams laid off, or in some cases, studios entirely shuttered now that the titles are no longer moving forward. And I think over the next few years, we're going to look back on a lot of these troubles and think to ourselves why Sony couldn't have just doubled down on what they knew they were good at, while simultaneously incubating new live service titles at studios that it sort of made more sense to be working on these kinds of games. And maybe have gone with maybe third-party partnerships or even second-party partnerships in lieu of jeopardizing their first-party output. Now, we know about games like The Last of Us Online, which have sort of been an albatross for them, and have now been officially cancelled as of December 2023, when they officially addressed the long under wraps and in-development Factions sequel, which was originally supposed to come out with The Last of Us Part 2, but eventually morphed into its own live service project. A lot of the reports seem to suggest that the game was fun internally. Still, based on what has been described as feedback from Bungie at the title, the game just never took off. Late last week, we saw the closure of Deviation Games, which was headed by former Call of Duty veterans Jason Blundell and Dave Anthony. And Jason Blundell in particular had a lot of experience having directed the campaign and zombies experiences in Black Ops 3. They originally signed a contract with Sony back in 2021 to develop a first-party IP, which would have been a live service game, but we saw that with the departure of Jason in 2022, the game never really got off the ground. I think Sony maybe got cold feet with the Twisted Metal live service game at Firesprite that was also cancelled recently, having been all too familiar with the failure of games like Destruction All-Stars back at the beginning of the PS5's launch. The game originally was a $70 title, but they pivoted it to a free PS Plus game during the launch window, and I think a lot of that had to do with the pre-order numbers they were seeing behind the scenes. Just this last week, we saw the leaking of Spider-Man The Great Web's trailer. This would have been a live service game in the Spider-Man universe, with a lot of similar gameplay to the single-player portion of that franchise, and the trailer itself looked almost complete entirely. It looks as though the game was really close to being ready to release, but the game's not coming out. It's been cancelled, as we know from the Insomniac leak. It kind of makes you wonder just how much of these cancellations have to do with the game not being fun or not being good, or if it has to do with what they perceive to be limited ability to charge players for microtransactions and monetizing the game once it's actually released. I don't know if the assumption is that these live service games would be free to play with microtransactions afterwards, similar to something like Fall Guys or Rocket League is today, or if these were to be paid experiences like Helldivers 2 that would have monetization on in an in-game store after the fact. I think you could certainly make the case that players would have probably paid to play The Great Web and The Last of Us Online, though to what degree I'm unsure. The factions mode in the original Last of Us, which got people so excited for this follow-up entry, really took off, but partially because it was already included within the first game. There wasn't some extra barrier to entry as far as showing up. I'm starting to wonder just how much the Bungie purchase for Sony, despite having its own problems, has become this really poor decision that's had lasting effects on the way that it develops its games going forward, with live service and single player. It's become clear over time that Bungie needed the money from the acquisition, more so than probably PlayStation needed a studio like Bungie under their wing. It seems almost like Sony was sort of trying to kickstart its live service efforts with an expert in the field like Bungie, while simultaneously trying to compete against Xbox in its own acquisition efforts, like the Activision Blizzard deal and also the Bethesda ZeniMax deal. And speaking to Bungie's sort of expertise in the field, I think a lot of that's sort of coming into question as of late. Destiny 2 was at one point pulling in hundreds of millions of dollars a year, in what I would describe as its frankly egregious microtransactions in-game, and is now on track, as we know, to miss revenue targets by nearly 50%, assuming no numbers change from the last reported numbers in late 2023. This revenue target miss is even still after the layoffs that they experienced last fall and last summer, where the company lost key staff like Michael Salvatore, who is known for his incredible music that sort of has carried a lot of the tone and thematic consistency in Destiny. The final shape comes out in June, but the community is littered with sentiment online about plans to quit once those players have seen the end of the story and the raid, having grown bored of the formulaic, tired seasonal content that Destiny has been known for as of late. And the headwinds for Bungie don't really end there. Marathon, which is one of the highlights shown from last year's PlayStation showcase, with its revival of that IP in the form of an extraction shooter, has had reports of its playtests with personalities and influencers showing that the game is seeing signs of trouble with being described as not very fun. And then you have PlayStation's other live service games like Fair Games and Concord, which have had CG trailers shown, but there's been no gameplay and really no details about them outside of those initial showings last year. The seemingly only bright light in PlayStation's live service efforts has really been the recent success of Helldivers 2, and that's mostly even on PC. And that means people who are purchasing the game on PC and purchasing the microtransactions and war bonds, Sony's losing a cut of that to Steam. I think the kind of win Sony wants is a live service that launches on their platform, where every single purchase sort of reinforces the stickiness of that console and that ecosystem, so that the players of that live service game, when they go to play other games, they might choose to play it on PlayStation, and Sony will collect its 30% from the microtransactions related to that game or the full game purchases themselves. I think with regards to Bungie, they're sort of a victim of their own success. Destiny 1 and 2 both launched in really underwhelming states, and it took years of updates, and Bungie expending a lot of its goodwill from the Halo days on players to show back up when both games got their first expansions in their first year, in The Taken King and Forsaken. Still, 10 years of Destiny and players are tired and fatigued by the greed in game with microtransactions, and the greed in giving just enough terminal conversations and weekly reruns of 6-year-old activities like Blindwell to continue onwards, and unless Marathon is a smash hit, I fear for where Bungie is going to pivot to. We know that they have a game like Matter in development, which saw investment from NetEase back in 2018 of nearly $100 million. The game was rumored to be an FPS or hero shooter hybrid, but it's really unclear what that game is. It seems like Bungie is sort of continuing to be this live service house, which they may have always been, but it certainly isn't serving Sony, I think, in the way that they might have hoped back when they first acquired them. Now, we know that based on reporting from around when the financial revenue target miss was first detailed, that Bungie's leadership is going to be replaced if Bungie misses their fiscal target later this year, and that Sony executives would replace the board that's currently leading over Bungie. Time will tell, and I'm not entirely sure which would be the better option for Bungie, being led by the current team in charge who may have more endemic knowledge of the inner workings of Bungie, or an entirely new board of people from Sony who might be a bit more open-minded to the desires and the needs of the developers underneath them. There's been a lot of questions around Jim Ryan's departure and how much of it is his own decision to leave and how much has it been corporate pressure to step down from the ensuing fallout that they've seen from the Bungie purchase and also from the live service efforts of all these different first-party studios. PS5 is doing incredibly well with its console sales, and the software sales on top of PS5 are also leading to a lot of revenue, but their margins are smaller than they have been in a long time at just 6%. And while it's certainly impressive the success of the console, and given how it started with chip shortages, the different shipping and freight delays from China, and air freighting over PlayStation's, but the business thrives on software sales, not hardware. And we've seen that the software sales, at least for first party, have been underwhelming compared to the previous generation. I think a lot of that has to do with the priorities they've given to first-party studios in developing live service games and less in the single-player games that they're known for. I don't think it's necessarily the worst time to be on PlayStation. The third-party output of games we've had from the last 18 months is enough to fill a backlog for years. We truly do have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the available titles to play. Still, I can't help but wonder just how much better it would have been for consumers on the platform if instead of all these projects being spun up and then canceled internally from around, say, 2020 to now, we would have been in a more fruitful position for the platform and for us as players in getting new IP entries in single-player games or even just sequels to the existing single-player franchises. Now, it makes sense that PlayStation wants a piece of this pie, but of the 12 games that they initially talked about being in development as live service games across their studios and partnerships, we've already seen at least 5 of them get canceled. And it's unclear if they're even counting the 3 at Bungie currently ongoing with Destiny, Marathon, and Matter. We know that the Guerrilla devs are currently hard at work on their own multiplayer game for Horizon, and that still hasn't been revealed to us yet. But outside of that one title, maybe the 3 at Bungie, Fair Games and Concord make 6, and then you couple that with games like the closure of Deviation's IP that they were working on, London Studios' IP of their fantasy game that was said to be a live service that was canceled along with the studio closure, the Twisted Metal game. There really aren't that many games left that maybe are in development still as far as live service games go. I really wonder how much of a pivot we may see in their strategy for live service and single-player games going forward once the hole that Jim Ryan's left has been filled. Jim Ryan said in internal emails that Sony believed at the time that the value they would extract from Bungie with their purchase of $3.6 billion would be greater than Microsoft's at nearly $70 billion. And I don't doubt that he believed that at the time, with knowing how they were going to utilize Bungie to sort of internally review and kickstart their live service efforts with what they believe to be an expert in the field. It's clear the purchase of Bungie has been a sort of albatross around PlayStation's neck. They're struggling internally with their own game in Destiny 2. Marathon is having its own struggles based on reports of its playtests. And to top it all off, since their acquisition, it seems that PlayStation has been relying on Bungie to review the live service games of all of its different studios, when in reality they're having trouble keeping their own going as it is. It seems more like the blind leading the blind than what you might expect to be a sort of mentor-student relationship with regards to how Bungie might advise the other studios in a live service market. It's clear that PlayStation has struggled to get its live service games off the ground, and I get the sense that the first-party output and compelling live service titles that we are expecting to see at maybe this year's showcase are still years away at best. And I think if we're going to see more of these, I think we're not going to see any of these games until the launch of the PlayStation 6. I don't expect Sony to stop developing these live service titles, and I hope we do truly get some incredible games from them. But my hope is that with the leadership change coming to PlayStation, we might see a more balanced approach to developing games across their first-party studios. More first-party titles, maybe some with smaller budgets than what they're used to, and that maybe there's a bit more of a balance between live service and single-player efforts, and even new IP. I almost wonder too just how well it might do Sony to, instead of pushing its own talent to build live service games, that maybe it enters into more second-party relationships like we used to see in getting live service games developed for the platform. I think we're going to get a lot of answers this summer on the direction of PlayStation and their studios going forward, and who knows, maybe by then we'll have the new SIE CEO already presenting to us during their showcase. Still, I think when we look back at the end of the PS5's life cycle, there'll be a sort of a collective understanding that the first half was really carried by third parties, and that the PlayStation's live service efforts were probably not worth all the effort they put into them, and they sort of squandered a lot of different talent and a lot of different studios in trying to push into this market. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.